Hello, my name is John Peace with the Rural Route Review, and I'm here today with a new co-host today with Cindy Green. Cindy, want to introduce yourself to the viewers?
Sure. My name's Cindy Green. I live in Bristol, Virginia. I ran for House of Delegates in District 44 last cycle, and I'm running in 2027. My district is all of the city of Bristol, all Washington County, and two-thirds of Russell County.
Well, and let me let the viewers outside of Virginia kind of know Bristol, Virginia, Bristol, Tennessee, a birthplace of country music. That's our slogan, and that's where a lot of country music originated. And today we're here with a special guest, Chris Hudson, producer, director, writer, I'm assuming. Is that correct?
Everything on this
Everything.
project,
Go
yes.
ahead and introduce yourself, Chris, and let the viewers know who you are and stuff. And you got a wonderful resume. Don't leave stuff out.
Okay. Well, first off, thank y'all for having me. So my name's Chris Hudson. I'm a documentary filmmaker from North Carolina. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, most of my life. And so actually before moving to the big city of Charlotte, lived in some small towns in North Carolina. So Southern Pines, Yanceyville, Angier, North Carolina, and then moved to the big city of Charlotte. So had both experiences in small and big towns. But I went to Queens College, now Queens University in Charlotte, and kind of majored in communications. And while I was there, I ended up interning at WTVI, Charlotte's PBS station. And I grew up watching countless hours of PBS as a kid. Rick Steves, all the travels through the back door in Europe, anything Ken Burns put out. And so I've always loved television, always tried to figure out and study it while I was a kid. That's what I realized. I didn't watch too much television. I was always studying too much television, I think, as a kid. So at WTVI, I got to do exactly what I wanted to do, was work on some documentaries and start my life in the documentary world. Ended up doing a number of local documentaries there. And then once I graduated, ended up doing a couple of World War II documentaries. The first one was called How I Survived World War II. And that took us about 10 months to do. And that was based off a 100 oral history that we did in the Charlotte region of World War II vets. And then we, at the time, it was the transition of going from beta and some of the old video sources to HD. And so we ended up re-interviewing a number of those World War II vets in HD, which doesn't sound like anything today, but it was a big deal back then. And so that documentary, ended up getting a Emmy nomination. And so that was a nice way to start off my career, I guess. And then from that documentary, I ended up doing another World War II documentary that kind of spun off called If They Could See Us Now, the story of Charlotte's 38th Evac Hospital. That was like a 30-minute documentary that we did locally, kind of told the story of this evacuation hospital out of Charlotte. But it was in 2007, I think, when Ken Burns, the war documentary, had come out. So it was kind of a local story to support his larger story. And Ken Burns came into Charlotte because Bank of America was one of his big sponsors. So he came over to the PBS station and did a promo for that documentary of mine. So that was a big win for me to meet one of my idols, documentary idols. So, and then kind of from there, ended up, documentaries aren't like a high paying gig most of the time. So I had to get into doing TV commercials and other projects. And kind of from there, I've teetered with documentaries here and there whenever I had time and could find the money to do other projects. My wife and I ended up moving from Charlotte to Clemens, where I live now. And we opened up a children's theater in Clemens, North Carolina,
Oh,
called Creative Drama Children's Theater. And we've been in business for about 15 years now. And I've kind of taken a step back now just to reconcentrate on my documentaries. But because of having our own business, I was able to go to grad school at Wake Forest University. They have a MFA program in documentary film. And so I spent 3 years at Wake Forest getting my MFA in documentary. So now for the past probably 6, 7, 8 years of trying to reconcentrate on doing more and more documentaries. And so my thesis film at Wake Forest was the Mayberry Effect. And that it went from being a 45-minute thesis film into a fully 90-minute documentary. And so that's kind of a brief version of my back history. So yeah.
wow. Cindy, I'll let you know how Chris and I met was, and I'm glad you did this, Chris. You reached out. I wrote an article talking about going from Mayberry to Mega in a little bit, and of course, I reference your documentary. But my first inspiration, and we're going get to your inspiration here in just a minute, was back in 2016, probably 2017, I saw an interview with Ron Howard. And he talked about Make America Great Again, but he talked about when was again? When was this great? Because and of course I've written some articles about that, and I grew up, and y'all, both of y'all are younger than me, but I feel like I'm kindred souls with you because I grew up with a lot of World War II veterans. My papa raised me, and my great grandmother raised me, and my papa was a World War II B-17 bomber pilot. I've written my first book about that. But his peers would come by the dairy barn. We dairy farm, and they would tell their stories. So I kind of, even though I grew up in the 70s and into the 80s in high school, I really kind of grew up in a different era of stories and with these men and stuff. And I'm gonna start out the first question for you, Chris. The origin of your documentary. What gave you the idea to do the Mayberry Effect?
So, I mean, growing up in Charlotte, I've watched the Andy Griffith Show my entire life between the hour 5 and 6 p.m. before dinner. It was usually on somewhere. And so that's always been in the back of my head. But I was looking for some kind of story. I love telling stories. I love fan documentaries, anything that are, if it's Star Trek, Star Wars, any Lego, doesn't matter. If you're like a huge fan of something and spend all your money on whatever it is, I'm kind of a fan of watching documentaries like that. And so I ended up having my background also in television, doing TV commercials. I've done probably 1,000 car commercials in my lifetime as well. And one of those car dealers was in Kernersville, North Carolina. And I ended up being on set for those car commercials, but our main character in those commercials was David Browning. So David Browning is the Mayberry Deputy. He's been doing that for 20, 30 years. And so when I met him, I mean, I'd seen him in the commercials before, but just being on set with him and talking with him, he's hilarious. He's a great, great person.
Yes.
Love David to death. And I'm looking at him going, he's an interesting character. Like, he's doing these commercials, but there's David Browning and then there's the Mayberry Deputy. And then when I found out he was from Bristol, Virginia, I was like, that's Bristol, Tennessee as well. So I was like, he's kind of a dual personality, and Bristol's kind of a dual personality from what I read up on. And so after a commercial shoot, a couple of weeks later, I contacted him and said, "Hey, David, I'm looking to do a documentary. Would you be interested in me doing a documentary about you as a Mayberry Deputy?" And he said, "Well, I'm kind of thinking about retiring and kind of stepping back, but let me bring you into this Mayberry world and introduce you to the other people in this world." And so I ended up, I think, interviewing him at his home for the documentary. And then the next maybe week or two later was at Mayberry Days in Mount Airy, North Carolina. And that's where he introduced me to Alan Newsom and Kenneth Junkin and all these tribute artists that love dressing up as the other characters from the Andy Griffith Show. And then I was like, okay. Even though I live 45 minutes from Mount Airy and had done commercials there and, been in some of the shops, never saw, the tribute artist, huge fan, kind of thing around Mayberry. So I was like, okay. And so spending time with all of them, they were all interesting characters, and they all just kind of like welcomed me into the Mayberry world, and I haven't left since. So that's kind of how it got started. But it was kind of doing that background history of going, okay, so Bristol, Virginia and Bristol, Tennessee have two different police departments, fire departments, school systems. David is this thing over here, and then when he's on camera, is this, that I could see a story playing out in Bristol. That was kind of where it originally took me. So I did some background history on research on Bristol, but really what it came down to is the bigger story of Mayberry than it was just about David's.
Hey, Cindy, I meant to ask you, do you know David Browning? And
I do.
You're Miss Bristol.
Actually, one of his daughters and my oldest daughter went to school together. So yeah, I know him and his wife and his family.
Yeah, he and Patty are great. They're great people.
Yeah.
Now, have you seen him do the Mayberry Deputy?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know when he wasn't doing it. I mean, you always saw him in that role, or I did anyway.
Well, good. The first time I met David Browning was actually, he'd spent 2 years, I think, and I hope I'm correct in this. He was the director of our outdoor drama, Trail of Lonesome Pine over here in Big Stone Gap. And I think I met him there, and then it was probably in the late 90s. I think I was at the Virginia Kettleman Association. He was the MC host / entertainment. And that's when he said, "Oh, I was director of Trail of Lonesome Pine and Big Stone Gap," and I remember talking to him and stuff. And let me tell you, for the viewers, he can pull off the Mayberry Deputy. There's in your documentary, there's others there that are good, but man, does he pull it off real well.
And he really was, one of the people, one of the catalysts to help Mayberry Days grow into what it was, and
Hmm.
bring in all the other tribute artists. He would see somebody and be like, I could see them playing a Gomer Pyle or Goober or, somebody else like that. And so, he was kind of the original one, and then brought into this cast. And, that cast is still around, even though he's kind of retired and not doing festivals anymore. But he's really, really the man that everybody's
Hmm.
looked up to in that world.
Yeah, definitely. So I think nostalgia seemed to be the topic of the documentary as well. So how did you bring that as a theme to your documentary, and why did you think that was important?
Well, I think once you go to these festivals and you see people dressing up as characters, or they're talking about a show from the 1960s, how much they love it, and they just kind of miss that, I guess, that kind of feeling. You realize, okay, this is a very nostalgic thing for these people, and then it's it starts thinking about, well, what makes you nostalgic? What makes me nostalgic? What I look back on and I enjoy, and so it you, you start going down that rabbit hole, and then I started thinking, what's the psychology behind nostalgia? Like, where does it come from? Why is it why does it hit us the way it does? And so the more you watch the TV show, the more you're around these group of people, you realize that when they're coming to Mayberry Days for the festival for a week, they leave in a much happier state. So they're not only nostalgic at the festival, but then they're pretty nostalgic when they leave for a couple of weeks afterwards. And they've created new memories to become nostalgic back on later on. And so, it's a nice cycle, but it's almost kind of helping, like, I think all of us use nostalgia as a way of life to cope with things in life.
Hmm.
And so what's interesting was the two professors that I interviewed in the documentary both live in England. And so Dr. Konstantin Sidikides is originally from Greece. He ended up teaching at Chapel Hill, UNC Chapel Hill,
Wow.
and watched the Andy Griffith Show when he taught there. And Dr. Tim Walchuk, he was under Dr. Konstantin Sidikides at Chapel Hill, and he's from the Netherlands. And he too watched the Andy Griffith Show. So when I went to England to interview them about the psychology of nostalgia, they were the only two people in the world that, hey, had lived in North Carolina, understood about Andy Griffith, had watched the Andy Griffith Show, and then studied nostalgia. So they could talk
Wow.
about not only, the TV show itself and what it made them feel, but why we process the way we process. And the big takeaway for me from that meeting was nostalgia is not necessarily all about the past, but some of it's about the future. And so when we look at it that way, I have two daughters. And when we do fun events, I know later on we're going to look back on those two, those fun events very nostalgically. And so, I think we're able to use it to look into the future and kind of help us navigate the future as well. So it's very, very powerful. It's a very, very powerful motion. And you look at the world differently, I think, when you think.
One of the things that you said was feeling. And I wonder if that is what people are chasing, is the feeling. And when I look at the Andy Griffith Show, I think of community and how it was a community. And we're now today we're so isolated, and we don't have that true community. I think maybe that people are starting to realize that, and that we need to build community and be able to know who our neighbors are, and like they did back then. So that was something you said that stood out to me, was the feeling that it brings out. Yeah. So John, I know you have another question.
Well, yeah, and I was going to add one thing. I was in professional sales for 35 years, and let me tell you, all the sales trainings I've been through, and Cindy does sales, but nostalgia is one of those emotions that sells. Okay, and she just came off the campaign trail, and one thing in the campaign, you got to get to their emotional level to sell. And that's one thing like Mega has done. And we know Southwest Virginia, and Cindy can talk a little bit about on her experiences on the campaign trail. But the other side does a good job selling emotion. And our side sometimes gets hung up on wanting to sell issues.
Mhm.
And I know you've seen that going door to door, Cindy, and all that. And people in rural America are real hesitant about change. And in my lifetime, I'm 56 years old. Change has not been good for rural America. I think about my childhood, downtowns. You go through so many downtowns in rural America. Doesn't matter whether it's rural North Carolina, rural Virginia. You see, storefronts shut down. Main streets are a shadow of what they used to be. And people look at the Mayberry and look at Andy Griffith and go, gosh, I wish I could go back to those days when they saw that prosperous downtown Mayberry and everything. And that kind of brings me to my next question. What are your current day thoughts of Mayberry, and where does Andy Griffith fit in today, Chris?
Well, I think the Andy Griffith Show was so influential that we still reference it 65, 66, 67 years later. That's pretty powerful for a TV show. I ended up creating a bumper sticker called "Make America Mayberry Again," and I had a few
That's yours.
people.
I've
Yeah,
seen that.
I had a few people come back at me going, "Do you mean make America white again?" And I'm like, "You're equating Mayberry to white, and I'm equating Mayberry to love." And so I kind of feel like you look back on Mayberry, I think people are looking back on, like you said, that small town feel, or that feel of love, or that community. I think it's kind of today, in today's stance, in today's world, it's something to aspire back to. And I don't think it has to be this huge movement. I think it just can be as simply as, who's my next door neighbor? What's their name? Where are they from? What are they interested in? Getting to know our neighbors. I think not only in the rural setting, but I think in where I live and even bigger cities, we're still, kind of singular. We don't even know our neighbors next door to us in an apartment or a house or a neighborhood. And so just simply just reaching out to our neighbors, whether they're different or not, whether they speak the same language or not, I think that helps build and create a better community that's more Mayberry like, to be honest with you. And so, it's something that I wish our country could do more of right now. I really, really, I mean, I still equate Mayberry to love. So, how can we be more Mayberry like in our daily lives? I feel like when we do our Mayberry events, whether it's in Mount Airy or in Indiana, or working on our Mayberry Man films, we're a community, and we just take that, and we're just happy, and we just want to share that with our people outside of our Mayberry world. And so, that's the love that we're feeling, that we just want to kind of share with everybody else out. So, and you know what, to be honest with you, take away the media, take away the politics, take away, all the angst that we're feeling right now as a country. I've spent a lot of time recently in West Virginia for the past 3 months working on some films in Princeton, West Virginia. And it's a small town. I've been into other smaller towns in West Virginia. And no matter our political differences, whatever that is, it is just, we're all wanting the same thing. We're all wanting that community. We're all wanting that conversation. We're wanting to have a good time and enjoy each other. And so, no matter our political differences, I still kind of feel that that's there and that's possible. It's just being able to get out and to be with people. And so that's important. That's where I see, the truth, and still America, how it used to be or could be. I still think it's still there a little bit.
You worked at food banks in your campaign. I mean, you talked to
Mhm.
people on, you know, personal outside of politics from your campaign. I didn't know whether you had any, what you experienced this past campaign season.
Well, I do agree with the what you mentioned, John, about change and people being resistant to change. I did hear that a lot. And what I think, my opinion is on MAGA, they have focused on any issue you have, it's because somebody else is taking it from you. So right now, their focus is on the immigrant population. You would have a good job. You would be able to afford your bills if it weren't for that immigrant. Instead of it being the billionaires and the millionaires who aren't paying their workers enough and who are exploiting workers and our natural resources. So, that's a battle when you get othered. I remember going to one house and talking to a man, and he said, well, you don't seem crazy. Because if you're a Democrat, they're hearing, depending on the news station you listen to, that we're all just, wild, trying to burn places down. And it was confusing to him that I just seemed like a normal person that cared about the same things he cared about. So there is definitely a disconnect. And a lot of that, I think, is the news that people are listening to. And we're all in our own kind of siloed information sources, which just exacerbates that and alienates us from being able to build that neighbor, watch out for each other. Who's your neighbor? You're being told to be afraid of your neighbor. So that counteracts that.
I'm glad you brought that up. I met one of my son's friends the other day, and I talked to him about how I work with Democrat candidates. And he goes, man, I can't believe you're a Democrat. You seem okay, or you seem pretty nice. And he was from the Blackwater, Lee County area, or he's in Lee County in the Blackwater area. And he was talking about, you're probably the first Democrat I've ever met in person. And then granted, we know he's met other Democrats, but I was probably the first one he knew that I was a Democrat and stuff. But now look, I'm going to go back to a documentary a little bit, Chris. One thing I was so tickled when I first watched it was how you had, some college professors and stuff on there talk about the fake, the false nostalgia of Mayberry. And they talked about, what did Mayberry run from 60 to 68, Andy Griffith Show?
Yeah.
What was going on in this country, and you never saw that on the screen. And maybe you can talk a little bit about your interviews with some of the professors about the false nostalgia that was presented in Mayberry, but it's for entertainment. The show wasn't a documentary. So
yeah, it wasn't necessarily reflecting on current times. I think they made like one reference to like a man on the moon, or going to the moon or something in one of the episodes, but that very, very, very little referenced. It was really more of an escape, and some would argue, and some have said that even the show was a nostalgic show for past times for the people in the show and making of the show. So when you look at it that way, you're like, it was entertainment. I think some people still kind of view it as like, through rose-colored glasses. Now, I would say, when you end up having the idea of when was life better for, this person? And it was always the question that even in grad school that I had, the discussion I had with my professors was, on what side of the tracks did you live on? And when was it great? When was it good again? And it was always kind of from everyone's different perspective. I think for me, looking back in the 80s and 90s, growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s, life was great. I had a great parents, great family, had a great church I grew up in. So I could look back at the 80s and be like, yeah, I'd like to go back there again. Realizing now as an adult that I didn't have bills, I didn't have work, I didn't have responsibility. We all bring something different to that perspective, nostalgia when things are great. I mean, there are friends of mine that didn't have a great childhood, So yeah, I don't,
you brought it up and talk about the 80s. See, I was going through high school in the 80s on a dairy farm, and that was the farm crisis. And I mean, it was terrible for us. Interest rates on our farm loan had gotten up to 18%. I actually had to show that to my son. I mean, he even Googled it when I told him. But see, when my granddad bought our family dairy farm, fixed loans didn't exist. And Cindy's in this industry and stuff. It was all bearable. And under Reagan, interest rates got up to 16, 18%. And that our farm loan doubled just on interest rates. So, like you were talking about nostalgia, and Cindy can jump in here with you growing up. I mean, Mayberry was just a little section of great for certain people. And, your background.
Well, yeah, I will say that time period, and historically, this country has not been great for the Black community or women. And, so you go back in that time period, women couldn't vote, they couldn't have their own checking account. The list goes on. And our Black community was fighting for their civil rights during that period. So there's definitely, in my opinion, a disconnect. And no insult to my co-host and our interviewee, but America's been pretty great for white men historically.
No argument
We
here. Yeah.
yield, and we
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
know, we
Yeah.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think when you see that resistance to change, if you've always been at the hierarchy up here and you see other women wanting to work, women wanting to have freedom to make their own healthcare decisions, and you start seeing minorities, you start thinking, wait a minute, you're taking what's mine. And you start feeling like it's a pie, and that if they get something, you're going to get less, when really it could raise everyone. All ships could rise if we would quit this fighting amongst ourselves.
Well,
And I think
go
it's
ahead,
fair to
Chris. Go
say
ahead.
too that like in the show, when you did see a black person, even though it wasn't often, it was never at a different level of living. They were incorporated into the neighborhood and the community. They were walking down the street with white people, not on the other side of the street from white people, but with it. So as little as they did show up, at least Andy Griffith and some of them had a little bit more foresight to include them as normal human beings, which they should have been, period. So, but yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's white people can have it good on this side. I think I'll tell you a quick story of what happened when I was screening my documentary in Cary, well, right outside, not Cary, Carborough, North Carolina. Before it came out, I was working on my African American section of the documentary. So I'd had maybe an hour and 15 minutes of the documentary done. I was screening it to get some feedback from some of the professors at Chapel Hill and some of the local people there. But I didn't have this African American section where, I've got Oprah talking about there were no black people in Mayberry and kind of going down that rabbit hole a little bit. So I didn't have it in the documentary. Eventually, at the screening during the Q&A, I pretty much got reamed by these professors in this community for not having any blacks in the documentary at all, even though I hadn't put it in there yet. They just hadn't seen it. It wasn't ready to see. And so I walked away from that documentary with two things I learned. One was that, yes, I've got to put that in the documentary to have this conversation, because I didn't want to leave it out, because it's very, very important to me to equalize everything. But what I was getting was like, you're basically a racist. And I was like, if you know me as a human being and how I grew up, I'm totally, totally, totally not a racist at all. But this is important to me. And so, but it also taught me how to defend my documentary and the choices that I made while making the film. It's just like, you just can't judge everything by its cover yet until it's completely done. And so, it taught me a few things there, but it was, and I don't know how to like really finish this thought or this part of it, but yeah, I think, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to end
Well,
that.
let me. I'm gonna defend the show just a little bit. That era, you had networks that told you what you could do or what you couldn't do. And I'm a Trekkie. Star Trek, the original Trek. I mean, that was the era where the one episode when Captain Kirk kisses Lieutenant O'Hara, and that was an interracial kiss. Well, you had networks that wouldn't even show that episode. So that was the era that Andy Griffith was being filmed and produced. So they had certain rules and guidelines by the studio and by the producers that they couldn't do certain things back in that era. And I talked to my daughter a lot about that. You can't judge everything through presentism. You can't judge everything through today's eyes. You got to go back there and see what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. So, yeah.
And I want to add that white supremacy, we're all swimming in that water and we've all been conditioned by it. So I think, not to beat up on yourself, Chris, I mean, there's times where I don't even realize my white privilege until it's pointed out to me. But it's what you do with that information that matters. And if you acknowledge it and then you try to correct it, that's what I think matters. And the fact that you did that, I commend you for that.
Well, when I'm able to like circle back to the idea of Mayberry as love, to me, it's just like loving our neighbors of who they are, and that's, I can keep relating and going back to Mayberry, but that's just, rooted in and going to church and being a Christian growing up, of going, this Hispanic next to me is a person, this black person is a person. I can learn something from them. They can learn something from me, and having a kind of mutual respect. But I also kind of feel like, hey, we've got examples of this kind of love. And one of those examples is the Andy Griffith Show. So an idea of Mayberry. So
it's that nostalgia. Well, Chris, I told you I wouldn't keep you more than 30 minutes and stuff. Give us a brief what you're working on, what's coming out. I want you to be able to plug it, and I'm going to put links and everything in the comments and the information on the video here. So
Well, 2021, when my documentary came out, I ended up sitting next to Dream of Denver, who was Bob Denver's wife. Bob Denver's Gilligan
Yeah, Gilligan.
from that show. And so Bob was in an episode of the Andy Griffith Show. And so when Dream and I started talking, I gave her a copy of my documentary, and she gave me some of her books about her and Bob's life together. And I started reading those. And so since 2022 now, we've been working on a documentary about her and Bob's life together. And not to spoil the story because it's out there, but they ended up having a son who's severely autistic, and they ended up taking care of him for 20 years before Bob passed away. And so they kind of left the television and film world in order to take care of their severely autistic son, Colin. And so we're telling Bob's story, but we're also telling about their love story and their story of loving Colin. So working on that, and then very beginning stages of hopefully doing a documentary about Skivvis. I don't know if you're familiar about Skivvis, but it's space camp for the interested visually impaired students. So a space camp for blind and visually impaired students. And so it happens every year down in Huntsville, Alabama. And so we're kind of going through the motions of figuring that story out. But I think it's fascinating. So those are, I guess, the two big projects besides working on some films. I am part of this Mayberry Man group, and that is a TV movie, or a movie that we did called Mayberry Man, and then a TV series. And so I end up, because of my documentary, I am one of the actors in the movie and the TV series, playing a documentary filmmaker named Craig Hudson, who has a documentary called The Mayberry Effect. But it's been interesting how Mayberry has taken me to different parts of the country and different parts of the world in order to kind of tell more of this Mayberry story. So I'm having a good time with it. Never thought I'd go down these different paths, but it's been a lot of fun.
Well, buddy, we appreciate having you on here. Cindy, any final words or any?
It was great to meet you, Chris. Yeah,
You too, Cindy. You too,
I watched your documentary. I guess it was a couple weeks ago. So yeah, it's nice to meet you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and you can find the documentary on Tubi. I always tell people to go watch it on Tubi because it's free. Yeah, might have to watch a few commercials, but it's free. But it's better for filmmakers like myself. But it's on Amazon.
I think that's
and
where I
Apple
watched
TV.
it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Hey, quick question, and this is totally kind of off the subject and stuff. Do you get reimbursed? What's behind the scenes when you get something on like a Tubi or Pluto or do you get reimbursed? I mean, just the mechanics of that, I guess. The business
So
model.
I get a residual check. So I was fortunate to get distribution with Gravitas Ventures, which is a good sized distribution company. And so they take their portion and then they send me a check every quarter of what it's on. So if people watch it on Tubi, I get a portion of that ad buy from the commercials on Tubi, or if someone buys the movie on Amazon, I'll get a portion of that movie or DVD sales, something like that. So usually, like I said, documentary filmmaker, not a whole lot of money in this world, but it's nice to, still be out there and generate some money and some conversation, kind of like today. This has been great.
I got news for you. Writing books is the same way, buddy. You don't get into it for the money, but you do meet great people like yourself, meet people like Cindy. I met Cindy about a year ago with doing some campaign training with her and everything. And just very blessed on the people I met. So it's worth my effort to write books and do that just from the people I've met and the circles. And we hope to have you back on here. We hope to maybe consult with you some on our messaging. Cindy's got an upcoming campaign coming up, and we got to get better at messaging and on promoting like Cindy Green as a candidate, as a person, and get away from a little bit of these issues and get her out there so people just know her. But anyway, I appreciate y'all coming on here. I'm gonna get off here and we'll be in touch. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.